So I just gave birth to my third child just a couple months ago, and I've had a lot of time, up with him in the middle of the night, admittedly, to think and reflect. Like many new and seasoned mothers, I have long struggled with the whole working mom thing. I grew up with a primarily stay-at-home mother, which was wonderful, and I'm not just saying that because she's in the audience. But because that was my experience, it's been hard to wrap my head around the idea that I could be both a competent, successful professional and a good mom. These things feel sometimes mutually exclusive to me. Either I'm going to be really successful in my career as a psychologist and a professor, or I'm going to be a hands-on, nurturing, domestic goddess of a mother. Certainly both were not possible, though. And I find myself, like I think a lot of moms can relate, struggling with what we so affectionately refer to as mom guilt. Most days, my work-life balance looks like anything but. And I find myself full of assumptions about how, if I can't do it all perfectly, then certainly I'm failing at everything. This is classic black and white thinking, or thinking in terms of or. And then I go back to some of my early training as a psychologist, where I was exposed to the idea of dialectical thinking, or integrating opposites. The term dialectic dates back thousands of years with its earliest roots in philosophy. In psychology, dialectical thinking was first applied by Marsha Linehan in the late 1970s in her dialectical behavior therapy. One element of this approach is learning to integrate opposites in your life so that they can coexist. Essentially, thinking in terms of and instead of or. So, for example, I am doing the best I can, and I can do better. If any of you are married, perhaps you can relate to this one. I love you, and sometimes I hate you. For me, I am a good mother, and I am good at my job. I've found dialectical thinking to be very helpful in my own life, not only in my personal life, but in the work that I do with the criminal justice system. Understanding who commits crimes, why they do so, how they do so, long been areas of fascination in our society. It's the reason why we have so many TV shows and movies focused on the criminal mind and the criminal justice process. It's why my psychology and law class fills up every year, only to have the students disappointed when they discover that we will not, in fact, be examining any dead bodies or doing any criminal profiling. Now, this fascination has unfortunately led to a system of categorization, of thinking about people in terms of stereotypes and labels, examples of or thinking. This makes sense, though, when we go back to our earliest developmental processes. We are wired essentially to understand the world in terms of good and bad. You are either a good boy or a bad boy. You are a productive member of society or a criminal. You are a victim or a perpetrator. Of course, reality demonstrates that we are all much more complex than that. Sometimes in a single day, we are many things. Let's take a closer look at this idea of victim versus perpetrator. Over the years in my work as a forensic psychologist, I've been in a number of different correctional facilities, and regardless of whether I was working with incarcerated men, incarcerated women, or detained youth, I found that their stories were often the same. Stories of early childhood abuse and neglect, sexual assault, poverty, discrimination, trauma. And when I use the word trauma, I really mean any significant adverse experience that causes somebody great distress. Recent research estimates that over 85% of incarcerated men and over 90% of incarcerated women have some history of traumatic exposure in the course of their life. For youth, that estimate is over 95%. Almost every juvenile in our justice system has some history of traumatic exposure. This is true, by the way, in our own backyard. I recently completed a pilot study at our own Porter County Juvenile Detention Center and found essentially the same results. Almost every youth we interviewed talked of a traumatic event early on in their life. Most of them talked of more than one. Why is this the case? Why are these things so closely intertwined? A dear mentor once taught me, children's behavior almost always makes sense given an understanding of the context in which they develop. Marissa was an adolescent I worked with a number of years ago. She had been trafficked to the United States from Guatemala at a very young age, and her early life, as you can imagine, was filled with abuse and neglect, sexual victimization, abandonment. Until she was picked up by the authorities, which led to a string of foster care placements and hospitalizations and ultimately juvenile detention, which is where I met her. Marissa got caught up in the system because she was aggressive and strong, and she had a history of assaulting authority figures and staff members. Why did she do this? Well, in the trauma world, this is what we would call a classic trauma reenactment. Marissa was provoking situations that led to her being restrained and then isolated for a period, much like her early experiences. And she was doing this because it was predictable and familiar. Understanding Marissa's context helps us start to understand her and. Marissa is aggressive and dangerous, and she is sweet and fragile and hurting. And understanding Marissa's and is one of the primary keys to being able to successfully rehabilitate her, rather than setting her up to fail. Let's take a look at another example of or thinking in the criminal justice system. Take a look around, pick up a newspaper. What is happening to the relationship between law enforcement and the community? It's extremely strained. You are either a good cop or a bad cop. Over the years, I've trained a lot of police officers on things like de-escalating crises and minimizing trauma and working with people with mental illness. Recently, I was working with a group of officers on minimizing trauma to children when you arrest their parents. And I'll never forget the officer who said to me, "Sometimes I have to go into people's homes to protect them, and I know that I'm going to cause them crisis at the same time. In order to save a child, sometimes that means I have to haul off his or her parents, and I know that that's probably going to mess that child up for life." This officer was struggling to integrate the realities of his work, that he has to be both good cop and bad cop, sometimes in the same incident. So what would an and situation look like in our criminal justice system? I have the great privilege here at Valpo of teaching a class called the Inside Out Prison Exchange course, along with my sociology colleague, Don Jeglum-Bartush. This is part of a national program started by Lori Pompa at Temple University, where we bring together 15 Valparaiso undergraduate students and 15 incarcerated individuals, and we hold the class inside a prison. One of the most wonderful aspects of this course is that we get to see the shattering of stereotypes right before our very eyes. We literally watch the students shift from or thinking, seeing each other as inside students or outside students, to and thinking, seeing each other as whole people. Stephen was a student in our very first Inside Out class, and he was quiet and shy, and I remember in his application to be considered for the course, he said, "I feel like I have a ton of potential." Although Stephen was quiet during our often very heated dialogue in this course, what he wrote in his papers was so powerful. He talked about his early experiences, things he'd done, mistakes he made, and regrets that he had that had led to his incarceration. Over the course of the semester, we watched Stephen gain confidence and find his voice. So much so that at the end of the term, his fellow students nominated him to be a speaker at our closing ceremony. This is a celebration where we bring together prison officials and university administrators and members of the community, an intimidating audience for any of us. As you can imagine, Stephen was reluctant to do this, as he'd never done any public speaking. But Don and I are pretty persuasive, and eventually he agreed. At that closing ceremony, in his speech, Stephen said,
"The confidence this class has given me will be something I know I'll never forget. I think this class has provided the incarcerated students a chance to see that we can have something to offer, that given the right opportunity, we can become something more. I lost a lot of confidence in myself that I could be anything other than what I am right now. I've been waiting a long time for an opportunity like this to prove to myself that this isn't who I am. You have no idea how much this has meant to me.
Stephen kept in touch with us in the months that followed, and 1 year later, he wrote me a letter in which he said,
Being a part of this class was the most influential experience of my life. I came into this class as a failure, waiting to prove to myself and to anyone who lost faith in me that I am more than this. To me, this was much more than a sociology or psychology course. It's giving me the confidence that I can rise above my past and that I belong in this college environment.
Stephen had started to understand his and, that he could be both an incarcerated individual and a college student, that he could have a past and a future. Situations like an inside-out class are of course designed to facilitate and thinking. But what about when we don't have formal opportunities to dialogue like that? What might the world look like? What if we started to think more in terms of and less in terms of or? What if Marissa was a girl with both problems and strengths? What if Stephen was a former inmate and a college graduate? What if I could start to see myself as both a successful career woman and a great mother? What if you could accept who you are and work toward change? What if you could leverage the power of not only in your own life, but in the lives of those all around you? And, not or. Thank you.